Welcome to Managing Uncertainty, a podcast series from the experts at Bryghtpath discussing global risk, business continuity, and crisis management. Will you be ready to lead your organization through its critical moment?
Hello and welcome to the Managing Uncertainty podcast. This is Bryan Strawser, Principal and Chief Executive here at Bryghtpath.
This is Bray Wheeler, Consultant here at Bryghtpath.
And on this week's episode, we're discussing the Secret Service's recent report published in November 2019 titled Protecting America's Schools, a United States Secret Service Analysis of Targeted School Violence. This report is available online, and we will link it in the show notes. It's a fascinating report that goes deep into 41 incidents of targeted school violence that occurred in K through 12 schools in the United States from 2008 to 2017. And they cite that these findings will help prevention efforts for schools and law enforcement across the country as communities work to develop threat assessment protocols that are geared towards preventing school violence tragedies. Some basic info that I think was shared, or some basic info that kind of kicked the report off, and then I want to get to the meat of this, which is really about the warning signs of potential targeted school violence. But of the 41 attacks that are profiled in the report, all but 2 occurred in public schools. So only 2 occurred in charter or private schools. 73% of these attacks were carried out in grades 9 through 12, so in high schools. Most of those schools that had a targeted violent attack had implemented some type of physical security measure, and 66% of them had either full or part-time school resource officers on the campus, so police officers on the campus. The most commonly used physical security measure was a school lockdown procedure, followed by security cameras, followed by alert systems that notified community members via text or phone calls. 61% of the attacks used firearms, 39% used knives. Shocking, the attackers were predominantly male, 83%, and white, 63%. And by shocking, I mean not shocking, because most violent perpetrators are male. 17% of the attackers were female. Their ages ranged from 12 to 18. The average age was 15 years old. Bray, any initial reaction to that information?
Unfortunately, that sounds a lot like what we've seen and heard, both in the news and just historically, sort of since this kind of came on the national radar, via Columbine,
and then Parkland and others in between.
That this is, the MO holds pretty strong to that kind of description of what's happened and who's committed it.
I would point out the sample size is pretty small, 41 attacks over a 9-year time period. I don't have the report in front of me at the moment, but I believe that the report is inclusive of all targeted school violence attacks, and they have a definition for what that means in the report. I don't think these were cherry-picked. I was a little surprised. I expected the number of male offenders to be higher than 83%, because it's almost, you look at violent crime, it's almost all male that occurs.
Yeah, that is a little bit kind of noticeable in terms of the number there, that it is as low as 83. Lower.
Yeah. So in the report, there were 10 warning signs that were highlighted of things that can be observed prior to a school attack that I think are worth speaking to. The first one is that there is no single profile of a student attacker or a profile for the type of school targeted. Attackers varied in age, gender, race, grade level, academic performance, and social characteristics, and the schools varied in size, location, and teacher-to-pupil ratio. The Secret Service's conclusion here is that rather than focusing on a set of traits of characteristics, threat assessment processes should focus instead on gathering information about a student's relevant behaviors, situational factors, and circumstances in order to assess risk. I think we knew this. This lines up, by the way, with the FBI's recent publication of their mass shooting, active shooter reports, where the behavioral science unit went into, like, what are the warning signs? What are the pre-attack indicators? And the Bureau's conclusion is essentially there was no single profile that said, yes, this is a person who is going to commit targeted violence. It was a combination of things that led there.
And I think to their point, it's really about the behaviors and noticing, people that are around these potential actors, differences in their behaviors and their
and it was about their behavior.
cadence.
It was about their behavior.
Right. What are they doing?
Right.
There's a difference, and what is that difference? And does that difference raise any sort of red flag for you? And if it does, being able to communicate that.
Take action on that. Number 2 on the warning signs, attackers usually had multiple motivations for their attack. The most common, however, involved a grievance with classmates, faculty, or staff.
Yeah, I mean, it's the different motivations, and oftentimes that tends to be kind of the thing in their life that starts to set off some of that. I don't want to call it the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, because there's probably a multitude of factors there, but it typically manifests there that they want to take action, and that feels probably like the path of least resistance to be able to take an action when they've gone kind of that far in the mindset.
Number 3 is that most attackers used firearms, and those firearms were most often acquired from the home. That many attackers were able to gain access to unsecured firearms in their place of residence. Others were then also able to gain access to firearms that were in a secured safe. For example, in the Sandy Hook shooting, that individual actually killed his mother in order to gain access to the firearms that were in a safe. I don't know if there's a combination or a key or exactly how that worked, but his homicide of her enabled him to gain access to the firearms that were secured in a safe. Knives were used in a lesser number of attacks. 39%, I believe, was the number we cited earlier. Threat assessment teams should explore if a student has access to any weapons, particularly weapons that are stored at home.
And that's almost one of those, you can get into the merits of it and kind of the political conversation of it, but reality is reality. People have those firearms in their homes, and that, again, that's the path of least resistance to acquire something. High school students aren't. They're not
walking into a gun shop to buy a gun because they can't,
or is likely to try and get one off the street based on the profile of these individuals that we're talking about in here. Now, certainly gang-related violence and things like that tends to be kind of classified and talked about a little bit different, and very much a threat nonetheless. But in terms of these school shootings, that's the path of least resistance to get that, and that's typically where those people have gone.
Number 4, most attackers had experienced psychological, behavioral, or developmental symptoms prior to their act of targeted violence.
Yeah, I mean, that gets to be it again. It's back to some of that's just reality. It's also it's also a sensitive discussion topic as well, because what constitutes what, how severe, who's doing the classification, has there been...
What's the actual behavior that's been observed?
Right. Has there been anything in terms of action by, the state government, the federal government, local government, around said behavior? Has the school done anything around, different behaviors that the student has exhibited in the past? I mean, it becomes a very key factor, but it's also a piece that can vary slightly and is open to interpretation. It's a little bit subjective in terms of how other people interpret.
Totally agree.
That.
Yeah, you can't see me nodding, but I've been nodding
right.
while Bray's been talking. I think this reinforces the need to make sure that students and parents are aware of what resources are available to them for mental health assistance, social services counseling, substance abuse treatment. Is to your point, we do get into a dicey situation here. Like, what kind of behavior are we really seeing? Is it psychological? Is it behavioral? Is it developmental? Is it an addiction? There's a lot of possibilities for what causes some of these. The point is, how do we make sure that they have access to resources that can help them in this situation? Number 5 is that half of the attackers had interest in topics related to violence, or as the report says, they displayed unusual or concerning interest in violence and weapons. That feels like a little bit of a stereotype. I mean, think about the Columbine. It was the trench coat mafia and
right.
Dark stories and Dungeons and Dragons or whatever. Forgive me because I don't remember the particulars now. It's been 20 years. But you had what I thought was kind of this irrational stereotyping of that. I mean, I wrote some violent things when I was in high school because, I mean, what did I watch? I liked Star Wars and Star Trek, and we're shooting people with phasers and cutting them in half with lightsabers. It's
right.
kind of violent.
Well, again, it gets back to the little bit of the subjective nature of it, the open to interpretation, the fact that some of these things can be pretty obvious in that segment, but that doesn't necessarily. To your point, there's lots of kids participating in those different activities and to varying degrees, and what degree is
what's concerning and what's not
to what person.
Right.
So mom and dad's level of concern may be very different than teachers' concern, may be very different than coaches' concern, may be very different than employers' concern.
So again, we see, for a threat assessment team, it's important to be holistic and look at the various dimensions of this and where does this fit in light of other factors for risk that should be considered as a part of that. Number 6, all of the attackers experience social stressors involving their relationships with their peers and or romantic partners. That every attacker in the study experienced at least one social stressor, most frequently related to bullying. Other stressors include family, academic, or school discipline.
Yeah, I don't know what my reaction to this one is necessarily in particular because I don't want to make light of those pieces, but we're also talking, if we're talking the average age is 15, which means more likely we're in that middle school, high school range.
There's a lot of social stressors.
There is a lot of social stressors. And so I think part of kind of back to the theme that you're kind of touching on, Bryan, is there's a lot of factors at play. We can't just extrapolate one of these things that we've talked about as a case in point for you're going to be an attacker and we need to watch you because, to be fair across the board here, that one in particular for this age range, that's just reality.
Yeah, I agree.
That they're trying to learn their way in the world, and especially in that middle school range where your hormones and your physiological and mental development is all over the place and emotional development. So I think the key piece there is where do those things lie? To what degree are those things being kind of put to the forefront in terms of their behavior or their conversations or their actions, what they're displaying in relation to some of these other things that we talked about.
Number 7, nearly every attacker experienced negative home life factors. That negative home life factors included parental divorce or separation, drug use or criminal charges amongst family members, or domestic abuse. These were a number of, there's probably more. I think those were some of the major factors. Absence of one parent or the other because of divorce, imprisonment, or separation was also a factor here. And I don't know. I think lots of folks have a negative home life factor to some extent. I was fortunate to have both of my parents growing up, and we had a pretty stable nuclear family, but my aunts and uncles were alcoholics and drug addicts, and that was all something I was exposed to. So definitely there was some negative, if I personalize this, there was some negative influence, in my broader family. I don't think that's necessarily unusual.
No, and I think again, not trying to minimize, but it definitely speaks to, I think the last kind of 4 that we've kind of talked about are all very related. They're not necessarily unique in terms of, grievance with a classmate or something like that. That's a pretty common thing. These all speak to kind of the mental, emotional, environmental factors that, a student, a child is kind of surrounded in, whether by their choosing or by other people's choosing. And I think that certainly these 4, definitely play a role. But they're not common. So you have to take them as
Right.
kind of the collective, which has been the theme we've been beating on here. But
Number 8, most attackers, so more than a simple majority, were victims of bullying, which was often observed by others. The study found that in many cases, the school was aware that the attacker experienced bullying, but the responses to bullying varied. In some cases, the school did little to intervene or intervened in a way that increased the bullying of a student. And I think just like the others, this is another one where I think you have to take this in light of the whole holistic view of what's going on with this individual and the combination of those risk factors. It's not just that they were bullied, but it's going to be a combination of this and other factors that will raise the risk in that case.
one, I think for schools and communities and things like that, the getting clear on what bullying is and is not, and not throwing it around loosely, but also taking it seriously in terms of putting in different intervention programs, making sure that kids have access to other resources within the school, making sure that, there are programs, processes, things like that are in place that you're not caught off guard. Because I think one of the things that is kind of in here that's not necessarily explicitly stated is the schools and the communities that these are happening in aren't a particular type of school or community that it's happening in. It varies from very suburban to a little bit more rural to
Right. There was no profile, right,
no
of the
profile
school.
Of that,
That's right.
And that community. So it happens everywhere. So you have to assume this can happen here. One of the cool programs at my kid's school that I thought was kind of cool is, so they have a couple counselors and they have different things for different needs of different students, whether that's kind of anxiety or they've got some, personal stuff going on at home in terms of like a sick parent or sibling or something like that. But one of the groups they have is kind of just geared around kids who may need kind of a forum to make some friends or to engage in more friendly kind of interactions with students, kind of regardless of, whether or not they're, aggressive or things like that. Sometimes those kids are just in a funky spot. And so it's an opportunity for them to kind of get together and just talk and hang out and play different games and stuff like that. And fortunately, one of my kids is able to kind of experience that and has been having an awesome time. And he's not one that doesn't make friends easy. He's pretty personable. He makes a lot of friends, but in terms of some of the stuff, that he's kind of in, it's a good forum for him to get together with different kids and kind of not only help them through, but talk through it. So, it's programs like that really can help shape and kind of build a community and build a culture within the school too of kind of no tolerance,
Right.
That other kids are starting to stand up for other kids and kind of self-policing a little bit, not to put the responsibility on the students, but that is part of it. If that's a world we want to live in, then got to start somewhere.
Number 9, most attackers had a history of school disciplinary actions, and many shooters had prior contact with law enforcement. I should say attackers, not shooters. Many attackers had prior contact with law enforcement. Most attackers had a history of receiving school disciplinary action resulting from a range of inappropriate behavior, and those actions included being suspended, being expelled, or having interactions with law enforcement. I think after Parkland, this doesn't surprise us. In the Parkland incident, that individual had, I believe, he had been expelled from school. But he wasn't permitted back on school property, whatever the result was. But law enforcement had 36 interactions with him prior to his attack at the Parkland school.
Well, and I think if like we've talked about, you're taking these other kind of key findings into consideration around that, it's probably not surprising that there is disciplinary action within the school, whether or not that's, prompted by that person or as a result of, conflicts with people who are bullying that individual or those grievances between classmates, things like that. The interactions with law enforcement, those can come in any manner of ways in terms of, as we talked about, interest in violent topics or, firearms and weapons or, just home life interactions with different things that are going on. So not surprising, given some of the other key findings we talked about, that would be a thing that's
right.
a finding as well.
Right. Number 10 and the last one, all attackers exhibited concerning behavior prior to the attack. Most elicited concern from others, and most communicated their intent to attack.
And that is probably the biggest one in there.
Yeah. It states that the initial indicators of a student in distress or exhibiting concerning behavior were most often observed by peers, school staff, family members, or others in the community, some of whom took action and reported, and some did not. And those that did report, action was not always taken on their reports. And I think we know this to be true. We've seen this in coverage of other targeted violence in schools and out of schools, that a lot of times people aren't willing to call and report behavior. And also that when their behavior is reported, law enforcement or other services don't always take the actions that we expect them to take, or sometimes don't even follow through on the report at all. Or in a lot of cases.
Or even other organizations. So if a student goes to school and school blows it off, doesn't take action, thinks a different approach is preferred. I mean, that is the biggest probably piece in here, and the biggest kind of lesson learned or takeaway for everybody is when you do see those things and it does raise those red flags and you're serious enough about it to report it, follow up, make sure that those things are getting communicated. And if you don't feel like it's sufficient, communicate it again to a different audience. Escalate those things. Don't let these things get lost in the shuffle. Because ultimately, the intent here, hopefully, for people is to help that individual kind of intercede before things continue to escalate down a road. Most of the time, these are people that are close to the individual, whether that's friends or family members or things like that. They're the ones that are going to probably notice that behavior first and kind of be most concerned about it and probably want to help.
Well, I think that's the first indication, right? I mean, or the first motivating factor, I should say, for when something is reported to you, that you want to help the individual that's in need. I've never worked in a school, but if I worked in a school and someone came to me with a report of concerning behavior, I don't know that my first reaction would be, my God, we need to deter the attack. Right. I think it's, how do I help this student or someone else that, needs help in this case? And the deterring in the attack isn't necessarily something conscious that I'm doing. I'm taking action to help somebody that I have this connection to as a staff or faculty member of a school.
Well, hopefully it's the organic prevention of that attack. To your point, that you're not first going there, although probably some people do, go immediately there. That's probably not the most helpful either, but also speaks to some of the seriousness that people can take with some of these reports. But I think, to your point, the need to help that individual in whatever way, whatever shape, or form, that's really the initial intent there. And so that should be taken seriously kind of across the board and escalated and kind of pieced together in terms of some of these other factors, around that behavior, putting that right context in place so that the appropriate escalation is happening as well.
And I think this goes back to kind of a twofold thing we've been emphasizing throughout the podcast, and that is that we believe that school threat assessment teams, this interdisciplinary group that's been trained to evaluate risk and threat and be able to take a coordinated response to help the student and protect the school, are a really effective way of managing these situations, particularly when you're looking at the kind of holistic view of what's going on with that student and all of the possible risk factors that are at play. And the Secret Service recommends this in the report. In fact, last year, it was late 2018, they had a report from their National Threat Assessment Center just about how to use threat assessment teams effectively in the K through 12 education environment to mitigate the risk of an attack and to help the student that's in need. But second, I think this also just goes back to the point we had earlier that when suspicious or concerning behavior is reported to the school or to another body entity that's out there, that you have to take these seriously, that you really have to follow up on that report in order to understand what's going on with that student. And having a threat assessment team helps you kind of formalize that process and get multiple folks looking at the situation and providing their own, trained view, but also the view from their discipline. You should have folks that have a security and law enforcement background, a counseling background, teachers and faculty that are a part of this so that you get that well-rounded view, holistic view of what's going on with the student.
Well, I think it speaks to kind of the other kind of sub-theme we've been talking through is no one person in that student's life can necessarily see all of these different factors that have been outlined here. Nobody's got that view. Parents can say if they're really on top of it, they absolutely know. I know my son or daughter. Not doubting that, but it's also you're not walking in their shoes with them all day, every day. You've allowed them to go out into the world. They're in the classroom.
How they are in that classroom might not be what you see at home.
Yep. Because I've gone to plenty of teachers' conferences where my kids are all well behaved, and I go, I want some of that at home.
We were just reading I just signed my daughter's report cards this morning. They're 6 and 8, so there's not a lot of serious academic stuff going on there yet. They're learning how to read and write and spell and all the basic stuff. But they both had comments about that, that they're such a sweet, caring, kind girl who helps others. And I'm like, where is this person? Because that's not what I have around the house. Mm-hmm. But you're right. I mean, we might laugh at that, but the truth is, your child might act differently at school,
right,
than what you're used to seeing at home, good or bad.
And I think that's the important piece. Is, I mean, you as a parent, you should be your child's biggest advocate. But again, recognize that you don't see them everywhere, and so there might be factors. That's not to say that they have, the poor discipline or poor behavior or things like that, but things might be happening to them that they're not sharing, or they're blowing off, or that are building that they don't know how to communicate. So having that team at school, having engaged parents, or an engaged village, that community of people surrounding that student, when those things surface in terms of some of these findings that the Secret Service has laid out here, kind of bubble up, or people report or say, this is really different. I don't feel good about this with, John or Jane, that those things are, like we've said, addressed in a way that is holistic, and kind of reasonable, and escalates as appropriate, to make sure that student is getting what they need, and hopefully by consequence organically solves the problem of really violent behavior later.
So we'll link the report in the show notes so you can take a look at that. And I believe we have an episode a few months back on another Secret Service report that's kind of related to this. We'll link that as well. I think that was the one about threat assessment teams and their recommendations. We'll link that up so you can go back and take a look at that episode. That's it for this edition of the Managing Uncertainty podcast. We'll be back next week with another new episode. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Managing Uncertainty, produced by the experts at Bryghtpath. To receive notifications of new episodes, join our newsletter at bryghtpath.com or subscribe through your favorite podcast player, such as iTunes or Google Play. Learn more about the services and trusted advice from Bryghtpath by visiting bryghtpath.com. That's BRYGHTPATH.com.